Hey, DawgNation, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza, and it is good to be back, albeit like 18 minutes late. Funny story, we're getting ready to start the show on time, the way we always do, coming off of vacation. I was raring to go, super excited. We actually had a fire drill in the building, and everybody, including us, had to go down to the bottom of DawgNation World Headquarters here, and we got the all cleared. Now we're back in the building. We're ready to go. A lot of fun. Chip Towers is a part of it. You are too. We're glad you're here. DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, begins right now.
From DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Let me begin today by saying thank you to all of you. So many of you had sent me some very nice messages here over the course of the last few days. I was enjoying vacation with my family. Many of you actually wished me well while I was gone, and I really appreciated that. We had a great vacation. Love being at the beach. Love this time of year to kind of recharge the batteries and enjoy some family time with my wife and my kids. And now we're back and raring to go for what is going to be a really fun week here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. I asked many of you a moment ago, last night on Twitter, to kind of weigh in on a subject. I'm going to kind of explain why it is that I wanted to kind of get into this. The notion of strength, Georgia's biggest strength for the upcoming season. And what I seem to be seeing here is maybe a difference of opinion in, kind of how a lot of Georgia fans view the strength for the Dogs and how maybe at least one outlet, the national media, kind of looks at this. And I don't think this is an insignificant difference here. I think the difference in opinion may go a long way in determining just how successful Georgia ends up being this season, in a season that we're all very much looking forward to. I like these ESPN way too early top 25 things that they do, where they kind of, look at all their preseason top 25 and they sort of address an issue. They'll do about one of these per week or so. And the other day, the one that I was reading was, here's the biggest strength of every too early preseason top 25 team. And I could not believe what ESPN wrote, not in terms of the fact that it's just way, way wrong. This isn't a criticism of ESPN. It's just really different than what I would have expected it to be. According to ESPN, a Georgia team they have ranked very high, I think number 4 overall in their preseason top 25. ESPN says for Georgia, its biggest strength will be its secondary. Let me read you here a couple of sentences from what ESPN wrote about this. This is Alex Scarborough weighing in on this, that they have to replace a few starters, but DeAndre Baker and J.R. Reed anchor what should be a solid secondary. Mix in the slew of top prospects recruited over the past 2 years, such as Amir Speed and William Poole, the Bulldogs should be in good shape. That's Alex Scarborough from ESPN talking about the Georgia secondary there. Now, obviously, we're big fans on this show of J.R. Reed. We talked about him on a recent edition of the podcast just a couple of weeks ago. I think it's kind of interesting the way that his national brand seems to be growing here. Outlets like ESPN, Athlon Sports, we read from a few days ago, they're paying a lot more attention to J.R. Reed. I think that's a good and exciting thing. And obviously by now, everyone has come to expect a big season, I think, in 2018 from DeAndre Baker. He is probably Georgia's highest-rated draft-eligible player, a guy that could have been drafted very high as this past spring had he gone on to the draft. And I think that the same thing holds true for him in the 2019 NFL draft as well. He should be a pretty top prospect, and Baker's presence is probably a big reason why Georgia ranks so high in terms of the secondary and why ESPN pays such attention to it. However, when I think about Georgia for the upcoming season, secondary is not the thing that comes to mind for me, first of all, in terms of what I expect Georgia's biggest strength to be. And I was curious to find out if many of you thought the same way that I did. So I did not want to poison the voting pool here. I wanted to just sort of put out an open-ended question, give you all a chance to respond to it. I called it an informal poll. I put it up on Twitter at DawgNation Daily, and the response were very interesting. And for the most part, people seem to agree with me. I think that Georgia's biggest strength this upcoming season is going to be its offensive line. And I wanted to find out if I was kind of out there on an island on that or not. When I asked many of you to weigh in on this, the majority of people, I didn't count the responses. As I said, it's kind of an informal poll. But when I listened to the responses and read what was coming in and what continues to come in at DawgNation Daily on Twitter, most of you seem to be with me that the offensive line, should be, expected to be, the biggest strength of this team here in 2018. And it's one of those things that we've seen grow from Georgia over the course of Kirby Smart's tenure. Go back to his first season in 2016 when the group, frankly, just wasn't that good. It was not only was it not a strength, it may have been one of Georgia's weaknesses. In 2017, the transformation was quicker than many people expected to be. all of a sudden, essentially overnight, Georgia became a pretty dominant offensive line group. And the standard that group set in 2017 is what Kirby Smart expects to sort of go into 2018, this new group, to kind of maintain that standard, take the baton. In fact, back during the spring, he talked a little bit about that subject. Here's Kirby.
Yeah, it's a different group because I don't think anybody's in there from the first year. So it's completely different because I'm pretty sure, Lamont might have been in the mix. But other than that, it's all new guys. And I think there's a camaraderie any offensive line group I've been around. But Coach Pittman does a tremendous job of them having pride in their double teams, pride in their points, them working to the second level. But they work as a unit as good as any group I've been around, and they take a lot of pride in that.
So taking a lot of pride in that, working well as a unit. But Kirby also mentions the idea of new guys. Now, when he says new guys there, what he means is the group that's going to be playing in 2018 compared to his first year in 2016, how they've evolved over the course of his time. But there's also going to be some newness to this offensive line here this season. And I think one of the reasons why outlets like ESPN, national media types like that, one of the reasons why they may sort of overlook the Georgia offensive line a bit is because of the new face or two that'll be populating this Georgia offensive line. In particular, Isaiah Wynn, who the national media thinks of as the anchor of this group from a year ago. He was obviously gone now. He was a first-round pick by the New England Patriots. And there's this assumption on the part of the national media, well, if you lose a first-round pick off your offensive line, that guy's going to be difficult to replace. But as Kirby Smart noted back during the spring, moving Andrew Thomas from right tackle over to left tackle, the fact of the matter is the Georgia offensive line may not skip a beat. I think Georgia fans understand this. I think the national media is about to learn it. Here is Kirby talking about the transition that Andrew Thomas was able to make during the spring.
I probably hadn't paid close attention to it as much as I should. That's hard to say in shorts, and today being the first day in pads, I do know this. If you don't notice him, it's probably a good thing. It's not like there's popping up sacks and things. It's very quiet. It's like, okay, there's not a lot of issues over there. We hadn't got a lot of pass rush off that side. He's made the transition well.
So here's what I'll say, and I think you already know this. Even though Kirby Smart speaks that at the very beginning of spring, Kirby wouldn't say that about Andrew Thomas unless he knew that was going to be true or had a strong expectation that was going to be true. This is the beginning of spring, and Kirby Smart's praising Thomas for the transition he's making. It's quiet over there. There's not a whole lot going on. That's a confidence in Kirby Smart's voice about Andrew Thomas moving over, which is no disrespect to Isaiah Wynn. He's one of the toughest, most physical offensive linemen that Georgia's produced in recent memory. But Andrew Thomas is an uber prospect here. He was a very good true freshman right tackle. My expectation is he's even better as a sophomore moving over to left tackle. It's a quiet transition with very few problems. That's what Kirby Smart sort of foreshadows there. And I indeed think we see that on the field this upcoming season. And not only that, another former big-time prospect, Ben Cleveland, who was a, five-star prospect for the class of 2016, didn't play a lot in his first season at Georgia, but in 2017 as a redshirt freshman became a starter during the season, earned that job on the field. Many expect him to hold on to that here in a 2018, manning potentially the right guard spot. Well, Kirby Smart talked, back during November when he finally emerged as a starter about all the things that Cleveland had done to sort of get to that point. This is one of the things that helps the Georgia offensive line this season, the fact that these starting positions have been earned the right way through competition during practice, through competition on the field, and Ben Cleveland may be one of the best examples of that.
Ben Cleveland's been practicing well. Ben Cleveland competed in practice this week, worked hard. He went with the ones the last 2 weeks. And just, y'all didn't write about it. It's not like a big deal to us. It wasn't like we said, we couldn't run the ball, we got to make a change. We just went with the guy who practiced best. Dashawn almost beat out Kendall this week. And next week, Ben might almost beat out Andrew Thomas because he backs him up. So we've got great competition in that position, and I think Solomon's going to respond the right way. He went in and played well, and they'll continue to improve.
So this laundry list of former elite recruits, Andrew Thomas starting at left tackle, Ben Cleveland likely starting at right guard. This is one of the reasons why so many of the Georgia fans that responded to me on Twitter had such high confidence in the offensive line here for 2018 because of the work that Sam Pittman and Kirby Smart have been doing on the recruiting trail and getting these guys on campus and then getting them ready to play. But for the national media, a lot of these names aren't household yet, including at right tackle, where I think a lot of Georgia fans have high hopes that it's going to be Isaiah Wilson who truly earns that starting position here for 2018. Now, recruitniks around the country know Wilson is a former five-star prospect. Writers at ESPN.com, more in the mainstream, they may not be aware of Wilson just yet. But his presence, as I said, is one of the reasons why Georgia fans have so much confidence about the upcoming season. In fact, that's also one of the guys that Kirby Smart had some praise for going back to the spring. Another reason to feel good about this Georgia offensive line.
I think he's learned a little bit more about how to compete. When you got to come over and block Lorenzo, Davin, Trenton, those guys all day, it certainly makes you come to work. It's a lot better than sitting over there watching somebody else do it and blocking a scout team guy. So he went over there and competed and got better during that time, and he's continued to improve throughout the spring, but he still has a ways to go. We still have a ways to go with the offensive line. There's a couple guys in there playing really well, but that's one of those positions that he's got to compete and he's got to grow as a player to get to where he can be and perform at the same level the tackles did last year.
Yeah, listen, good reminder there from Kirby Smart. This has got to be earned on the practice field this summer and then on the field once the season begins. But I don't think it's wrong for Georgia fans to have confidence in Isaiah Wilson, a former elite recruit, to being able to do just that. And overall, I don't think it's a huge surprise that Georgia fans sort of know their own team better than the national media does. But this, to me, is not a distinction without a difference. There is some real meaning here. I think if you had your choice of which strength you'd want to have for the upcoming season, I think offensive line is a strength that you'd want your team to be known for. It's an identity every team would aspire towards. I think it makes it easier for the transitioning running backs. Sony Michel, Nick Chubb, they're gone. DeAndre Swift now toting a heavier version of the load. His job is made easier because of this offensive line. Jake Fromm and the play calling. In 2016, there were some frustrated Georgia fans because sometimes the Georgia play calling just didn't make a whole lot of sense. But it's easier to call smart plays when you trust your offensive line to block. And here in 2018, I think that Georgia fans and the Georgia coaching staff will trust its offensive line to do just that. I mean, I think the preseason magazines, which I love reading, and the online publications that sort of debate this stuff this time of year, I think they've all rightly put Georgia in this playoff conversation this upcoming season. I think in some cases, though, Georgia may be in the right place for the wrong reason. The real reason why Georgia has a chance to not just match last year's success, but maybe even surpass that here in 2018 is because of Kirby Smart's offensive lines. His third one may very well be his best thus far, and that's really good news for UGA fans. It's good to be back with you. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Marco's Pizza, and we're glad you're here. A little bit of a late start for us on video today because of some weird stuff going on in the building here. We had a fire drill a little earlier, but nonetheless, we're glad to be here on the DawgNation Facebook page, DawgNation Twitter feed, DawgNation YouTube page. Thanks for watching us on video. Really excited about being back with our friends on the radio today on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We love our home there in the Classic City at noon each day, and then in podcast form, wherever podcasts can be found, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, the world-famous DawgNation.com. We're just really, really glad that you have chosen to be a part of our program here today, presented by Marco's Pizza. And speaking of Marco's Pizza, they invite you to say hello to authentic Italian quality pizza from Marco's, where you get fresh-made dough, an original sauce recipe, and 3 signature cheeses on every pizza. Enjoy 2 medium, 2 topping pizzas for just $6.99 each. Every store, every day, the Italian way. Hello Primo at participating locations. Boy, I tell you what, I love that price. $6.99 each for 2 medium, 2 topping pizzas. You cannot beat that from our friends at Marco's. We were going to get Chip Towers here coming up in just a moment. We'll talk about a lot of football with him. We'll also congratulate the UGA track and field team for its national championship when Chip's on the air with us. We'll do that here coming up in a couple of moments. Before that, though, let me squeeze in a couple other pieces of news. Let me start with running backs here. You know, I mentioned how the Georgia running backs job here in 2018 is going to be aided by what I believe is a better offensive line. And I think that the transition from Nick Chubb and Sony Michel to the new group, primarily led by DeAndre Swift, maybe including a healthy Zamir White here, certainly a role for Elijah Holyfield, Brian Harrion. You know, that job is all made easier when you have big holes open in front of you and big behemoth offensive linemen opening them up. Case in point to that, I saw with the Westgate in Las Vegas, and the Westgate, for those of you that maybe don't follow the gambling market all that closely, the Westgate's sort of one of the market-leading sports books out in Nevada. They are among the first to sort of put out odds, and their odds, I think, are generally thought to be, you know, the more trustworthy, more reputable out there in Nevada. And they came out with their Heisman Trophy odds. And I saw where DeAndre Swift had a very, very surprisingly good odd to win the Heisman Trophy. 20-1, the Westgate has DeAndre Swift. It puts him right there among the favorites in the country. He has the same odds, for instance, as Jarrett Stidham, the Auburn quarterback, who's clearly the leader of that team. You know, Swift will sort of share some of those leadership duties with Jake Fromm, who's also at like 14-1 to win the Heisman Trophy. But a very good odd, good price there on DeAndre Swift, which I think is something else to get UGA fans excited about the upcoming season. We'll talk more about that later on in the program. Let me also squeeze in a little recruiting news here before we bring on Chip Towers. And tomorrow, Jeff Sintel will be back with us, and I'm looking forward to diving into a lot of topics with Jeff. But one of the things we're going to have to deal with is what's going on here with UGA linebacker commit for the class of 2019, Tresman Marshall. Marshall's been taking a good bit of visits lately. I think we have some video evidence to prove this. At Auburn recently, kind of showing off in the Auburn uniform, having a good time there, and the GIF there online. Also, I guess recently taking a handful of visits. I believe that 24/7 Sports has reported that he's taken 3 recent visits in the last couple of weeks to Florida State. And you see Marshall there in Doe Campbell Stadium wearing kind of an alternate Florida State uniform. For those of you watching on video, you can see that. On audio, I'm having to describe it to you, but I guess there is some chatter here that there's interest growing between Marshall and Florida State. What's going on about this? Well, I'm looking forward to having Jeff Sintel here on DawgNation Daily tomorrow. We'll talk a lot about what's going on with the Tresman Marshall pursuit and kind of how that factors into what may happen to Kobe Dean or some of the other linebackers that Georgia's kind of been in conversation with. That's all coming up. Good stuff there from Jeff Sintel on Tuesday. But here on this Monday, I'm really glad to welcome back Chip Towers to the program. As I said, we'll talk a lot of football. We'll congratulate the track and field team for a national championship. It's a fun Monday conversation. We're glad you're a part of it. DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, rolls on right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Chip Towers here. Always love having him on the program. It's always fun to catch up with him on everything going on with UGA. And it's been a busy spring and summer for the Bulldogs on the football field and everywhere else, too. We'll get into some of that with Chip here coming up in just a moment. But, Chip, let me first of all say good morning. Welcome back to our program. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hey, glad to be back with you, Brandon. Hope you had a restful week off. And, it's still popping around UGA. Here we are just about out of June, and things are still happening.
Yeah, no doubt about that, and thank you for the kind words. We did enjoy our vacation. We're certainly glad to be back here today. Let me start with a subject that I was dealing with before you came on the program, and that's what I think of and what I seem to be seeing as a difference of opinion from some Georgia fans and maybe some of the national media who maybe the media hasn't quite caught on to the fact this Georgia offensive line is expected to be pretty good here this season. I polled a lot of Georgia fans yesterday, and they sort of overwhelmingly mentioned offensive line as the likely strength for Georgia this season. And I think that bodes well for the Dogs here, Chip. And I think it's kind of interesting that some in the national media may be slow to catching on to just how many former elite recruits should be populating that line for the Dogs this season. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I actually agree on all counts in this particular, on this particular subject. And that's not always the case. And what I mean by that is, I think Georgia is in an unusual position. Now, what happens a lot of times on the national media, and I can say this because, I've been in that position myself where you're trying to survey the entire country.
Yeah.
And a lot of these guys, they're just basing on returners, returning starters and starters lost, and when you look at Georgia just in that regard, you could see, well, oh my goodness, they're losing, they're losing Isaiah Wynn, and he was a huge part of the team, and what are you going to do at left tackle and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, where Georgia has really separated itself in recent years is just really, there's elite offensive line recruiting, and there's just, I guess you can call it like ultra elite,
yeah.
And that's what Georgia has done. And between Andrew Thomas, I haven't heard anybody anywhere who doesn't think that that's going to be a smooth transition from right tackle to left tackle. It's not a small thing most of the time, but everybody I've talked to, most importantly, Georgia coaches Kirby Smart, believe that he's making that transition quite well and quite readily. And everywhere else, you're kind of plugging in and reloading. The options at right tackle with Isaiah Wilson stepping up there and the new kids coming in, left guard, you're in good shape, Kendall Baker, but everybody's excited about Jamari Sawyer and Trey Hill, and so the possibilities are limitless. I agree. I think it's going to be a strength, and I'm normally a guy who leans really hard on experience and certainly some leadership on the offensive line. But I think Georgia's pretty good as they are.
And I think it's pretty interesting that you bring up a couple names that I didn't mention on this show when we were talking about this a few minutes ago. That's Jamari Salyer and Trey Hill. Hill, who got a lot of praise for his work during the spring. Salyer, who Jeff Sintel will tell you is the best interior offensive line recruit he's covered in his time in that industry there. And those are also not names that the national media has time to focus on when you're trying to do a brief survey of the entire country. But Chip, I can tell you, and I know you already know this, there are a lot of UGA fans who think Salyer's going to end up starting at left guard. So that's another thing that sort of factors into this discussion about, another former uber recruit or ultra elite recruit. I like your phrasing on that. Another former ultra elite recruit who could be slotting in right there with guys who have a pretty similar recruiting profile.
Well, and the best thing about it is if Jamari Salyer ends up starting at left guard, which many believe, that's obviously why he was recruited here. It's not going to be handed to him. So, I mean, it will mean he's better than a lot of really good guys. I mean, I think, when all said and done, Georgia also has some fairly experienced walk-ons over on the offensive line as well. So when it's all said and done, you're talking about 17 or 18 different players, to choose from. And when you take the cream of a crop of a group like that, you're going to be an elite unit. And so there's a lot to be excited about on the offensive side of the ball. Now, we can talk, we got all summer to talk about it. We're entering into the dog days now about how that offense is going to have to be good, just based on they're definitely going to at least have to hold serve a little while until that defense figures out, who they're going to have where and exactly how they're going to play. That's going to take a little bit of time. But the offense is going to, have to play well this season. And I think they will start because of that offensive line, number one.
All right, let's talk about DeAndre Swift for a moment here. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on something that not everybody cares that much about, but I do think it's kind of interesting. Back in January when Bovada, which is an online sports book, when they released Heisman odds, DeAndre Swift was at 33-1 to win the award, which is kind of in that realm of being a bit of a long shot pick. But when Westgate, which is a Nevada sports book, when they released odds here in the last couple of days, they had Swift at 20-1, which is not really a long shot pick at all. That kind of puts you in the same conversation with like Jake Browning of Washington and Jarrett Stidham of Auburn. That sort of puts you right there in that, the thick of that conversation. I think that's kind of an interesting nod in Swift's direction that at least, one Nevada sports book thinks that Swift is going to be a very big part of this Georgia offense, almost as big as Jake Fromm. It's kind of an interesting take from the folks out in Las Vegas, is it not?
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch, exactly how Georgia utilizes DeAndre Swift to what extent they do. Because, again, it's kind of like the offensive line. You have a lot of options there, ranging from Elijah Holyfield to Zamir White. Everybody wants to get a look at the new kid, and, who knows what James Cook is going to look like once he gets here. There's just a whole lot of options. But you know what you have in DeAndre Swift. I really thought kind of the way Georgia handled DeAndre in the spring, a little bit telling, the fact that they were so delicate, careful with his use. And, which just tells you, we don't need to see anything from you. We're going to make sure we get you to the fall, 100%. And based on the glimpses that we saw, I mean, there's some incredible stats that DeAndre put up. Granted, he's coming in there in a third person role, with Chubb and Michelle, but kind of in a specialized role. But his production was through the roof. And, depending on how much he can take, Georgia has the option of just heavy DeAndre Swift or going like they have in the past several years, a more even distribution between several backs. For DeAndre to be in that conversation, he'll have to be, the primary offensive weapon. But based on what we've seen, he certainly could handle that load if Georgia, wants to give it to him.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a moment because I guess if I was going to have one concern about DeAndre Swift, it'd be this. After the SEC championship in which he really put the game on ice for Georgia with his long touchdown run, it was one of the best highlight plays for Georgia for the entire season. He didn't really capitalize on that in the playoff quite as much. Just 4 carries for 6 yards against Oklahoma, just 4 carries for 15 yards against Alabama, the 2 playoff games. Maybe had a chance for some bigger plays, and he ran into Andrew Thomas twice once against Oklahoma, once against Alabama. That's not a criticism of Swift, but I guess it would have been kind of nice to see him in those playoff games find a way to capitalize in the big moment he had against Auburn. That's probably, for me, the only concern I have about Swift going into the upcoming season.
Well, and that is the unknown. I mean, it's a whole lot different being the featured back than it is being the third back. And that's the thing. I mean, even Nick Chubb lining up every game, knowing that there's probably a 90% chance he's going to get the ball. And when every eye on that defense is looking at you, expecting you to get the ball, that's a whole different ball of wax. And when DeAndre Swift often was on the field with either Michelle or Chubb, so that made him, even more of a threat. The unexpectedness of it and being able to get him into open field. So that's the unknown. Now, I do think he's going to be able to handle it. The other part is how productive can he be, between the tackles and helping you produce that play action game. We don't know, at this point. We'll see. But I think that's a justified concern, and it's one of those that really, Kirby and Dale McGee and those guys can't tell you unequivocally what that'll be like until you get into into the fire on Saturday.
You're going to talk to the Georgia track and field team here in a moment. They win the national championship. I want to discuss that with you here in just a minute. Before that, though, let me squeeze in something else on the football-related stuff. I think I probably told you before that I love preseason magazines. I like preseason chatter. I like to see what writers are saying about the entire country. I like seeing what these folks are saying about Georgia. I've always liked that. It's just really fun for me. And as I read a lot of these preseason magazines and some of the online stuff, it's interesting to me how much pub J.R. Reed is getting. Now, that's obviously from a lot of Georgia fans' perspective for good reason, given what Reed did a year ago. But it wasn't that long ago, Chip. As you know, this was a transfer from Tulsa whose claim to fame was his relation to, D'Angelo Gibbs. And now Reed is one of these guys that shows up in every one of these blurbs about the Georgia defense in every national magazine. It's interesting how his fame has grown so quickly, is it not?
That's one of the, wonderful things about recruiting, the great recruiting stories. I love the ones that, are supposed to be in the throw-ins, or the guys like Thomas Davis or David Pollock, who didn't come in with great fanfare, probably played a different position, and then they turn out to be just as good or better than, a lot of their counterparts. And J.R. Reed is, that's probably one of the only unquestioned positions on Georgia's defense heading into this season, maybe along with Jonathan Ledbetter and Tyler Clark. He's the real deal. And it's good to see him get some national mention. And here we are sitting here 2 years into this endeavor, and we don't know still if D'Angelo Gibbs is going to play or not. But we know that J.R. Reed's probably going to start every game at safety for the Bulldogs. And, when you look at it closer, I mean, I don't know what his deal was coming out of high school and at Tulsa and all that kind of stuff. But, I mean, between his pedigree, his family, and then just his measurables, his metrics, always were very good. But what you can't know is just, when you get into a game situation, I mean, how many times do we see J.R. Reed make really great heady plays, just to, see the action, follow the ball, and he's really come into his own. And now, it's gone beyond just being a good player. I mean, if you talk, those of us who talk to, Georgia every week during the season and when they're active, realize that J.R. Reed is an unquestioned leader on this team, kind of a spokesman, probably the foremost spokesman, him and Ledbetter, for that defense. I would say he's got a good shot of being named defensive captain before this thing's all done. Yeah,
that's really interesting to think about. Chip, you can take one look at me and realize pretty quickly I'm an expert in neither track nor field. Know the ins and outs of this, as well as anyone. What does it mean here that Georgia claims this national championship in track and field?
Well, first off, Georgia is going to vault into the top 10 in the nation in terms of an athletic department in the Learfield Sports Directors Cup standings. They were, hovering around there between 12 and 15, and this will catapult them up considerably with a first and second place finish. And listen, let me tell you, those women, you could not have been any closer 2 years in a row to winning the outdoor national championship. They were indoor national champions as it was. Just really an incredible race. If you hadn't seen it, Google up the 4x400 that Southern Cal won, and which ultimately, knocked Georgia out of the national championship hunt right there at the end. But Petros Ciprianou is the reason. That guy's incredible. He's got international reach. He was already very, very impressive in what he was doing for Georgia as an assistant in bringing European athletes over in the field event. In particular, they already had a great throws guy, and then he's managed to also turn around in the sprints as well. And it's a complicated sport. It's really hard. There's not a ton of scholarships. There's not a ton of money, as it were, to go around. So it takes some real innovative work on the parts of these head coaches to put something like this together. And Wayne Norton, before him, had done a really good job, and he's just taking it to a new level. I'm actually about to walk in the Butts Mayor Building now and meet with some of those athletes, and I'm actually going to talk to Lewis Gainey, Georgia's all-time track coach, to kind of help me put some perspective on it, because it's so hard to figure. Georgia's kind of in recent years been really strong in the field portion of track and field, but they've picked it up considerably on the track as well. And, that's an incredible accomplishment, knocking off the Floridas, Tennessees, Texas A&M's, Oregons of the world and inserting yourself right in the top. And it's elevated Georgia overall as a program as well.
The legacy of the great former runner Spec Town served well by the performance by the Georgia track and field team here over the course of the weekend. Chip, great stuff from you. Thanks for being with us here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. We'll look forward to catching up with you soon and look forward to reading a whole lot from you at DawgNation.com.
You got it.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie to you, and I hope one of the things that you appreciate about the show is I don't really pretend to know things that I don't know, and until recently, I did not know that there was an indoor and an outdoor track and field, and I guess I still don't quite understand why you have two versions of the sport, but Georgia's doing well in both now, and as Chip mentioned, I did get a chance while I was on vacation to see the highlight of the women's sprint there, where the USC runner came from way back behind to win it. It was quite a dazzling thing to see there. Pretty wild stuff, but a great job there by the UGA track and field team claiming that a national championship. That's always a lot of fun to be a part of. All right, time now for our SEC Through. Looking forward to being back on SEC Country Live this afternoon on the SEC Country video channels. Myself and Mike Johnson doing that. Excited about that. And one of the things that we'll no doubt get into is some of where these other SEC names come in on these Heisman odds. We talked to Chip a moment ago, and I mentioned myself the fact that DeAndre Swift is at 20-1 to win the award. That's a pretty good odd for Swift there. It puts him in really good company. Let me see if I can figure out some of the other guys here who are at the 20-1 group with DeAndre Swift. You got Jake Browning, the Washington quarterback, Auburn quarterback Jarrett Stidham. I mean, think about that comparison here for a moment. Stidham and DeAndre Swift sort of side by side there. I mean, I think Stidham's a real candidate to win this award here this season. And if I think that about Stidham, and if the odds are the same here for DeAndre Swift, that says something pretty good about him. Some of the other SEC names that come in there, you got Tua well ahead of everybody else. Tua is at like, what is Tua? He's like 11-1, something like that. He's at 10-1 actually. I mean, listen, I realize it's going to be somewhat of a homerish statement to make, and I'm sure some people will sort of criticize it for that. But the idea that Tua is well ahead of the pace of Jake Fromm in terms of being a Heisman candidate, I just don't see that. I mean, the one thing that Tua's got going for him, there's no doubt about this. He's going to have a very good offensive line, too. We talked about the Georgia offensive line. The Alabama offensive line is going to be just as good. There's almost no doubt about that. He's going to have a great crop of wide receivers to work with. But the people who say, yeah, but it was just a brief window of playing for him here in 2017, they're not completely wrong for bringing that up. I mean, there is something that Fromm has proven over the course of a full season that Tua Tagovailoa has not proven yet. So Fromm's at 14-1. He's behind Tua Tagovailoa. The notion that Tua is the favorite to win this award, I find that to be a bit much. But this is probably also an example of kind of being maybe the best player in the best team. Alabama's going to get a lot of those preseason number one nods, and that's what a lot of this kind of comes down to there. So interesting stuff. That's all from the Westgate there in Nevada. We'll talk more about that on SEC Country Live later on this afternoon. AL.com, who is a site there in Alabama that covers Alabama and Auburn, they do kind of a clever thing each and every year where they poll the sports information directors of the various SEC schools to come up with a preseason poll for the upcoming season. Now, many of you are aware what an SID, or a sports information director, does. They're sort of like the PR, leader, public relations leader for the programs. They are very knowledgeable about the other programs in the SEC. They go to all the events, they collaborate together, and they poll them about the upcoming season. For the most part, the SID poll, as published by AL.com, did not have very many surprises at the top. It was very much like all these other things that you've kind of seen so far this offseason. Alabama's at 1, Georgia's at 2, Auburn's at 3. But there are a couple of examples of it getting interesting beyond that. LSU comes in at number 4 on this poll. Now, if you want to compare the SID poll, AL.com, to this other stuff you're going to see in preseason magazines, the other stuff you're going to see online, virtually no other outfit's going to have LSU at number 4. You almost have to wonder, is this an example of just old habits dying hard for what is, to be frank, sort of an older group of SIDs? They're used to seeing, SEC polling look very similar with LSU near the top. Is this just an example of that? They're so used to penciling in LSU in sort of the top third of the SEC that they do that once again, because common wisdom would seem to suggest LSU is not the 4th best team in the SEC this season. We'll see how that plays out. That's a little bit surprising. And maybe sort of the same idea, opposite side of the coin, for Mississippi State, who the SIDs in AL.com had 7th in the SEC, essentially the 50th percentile for the league. But, Mississippi State clobbered LSU a year ago. There's a lot of thought that Mississippi State can be, quite good here this season. I believe, even though it's first-year coach Joe Moorhead, if the Bulldogs only were to finish, 7th in the league, about, the halfway point, I think there'd be a lot of disappointment along a lot of Bulldogs fans about that. And then Tennessee comes in at 12th on this list. And that's going to be one of the real storylines here this season. For Jeremy Pruitt, who's trying to build a program there at Tennessee, I think some way he's got to find a way to avoid finishing last. He's ahead in this poll of just Arkansas and Vanderbilt. And that's pretty consistent. Because of the winless, conference record a year ago, most of these publications are going to have Tennessee very near the bottom, if not the very bottom. And Pruitt's got to find a way to get himself out of the cellar if he wants to build some momentum for the upcoming year. Let me do a couple other quick stories here for a moment. We've talked a lot about Josh Belk, the former Clemson signee, leaving Clemson, somewhat surprisingly visited Georgia. That gave maybe us some faint hope here for a moment that he might end up choosing the Bulldogs. He was always favored to go to South Carolina, and over the weekend, Belk makes that official. He is going to South Carolina. I think this is a big get for Will Muschamp and the Gamecocks. He'd have to apply for a hardship to be eligible for 2018, but his immediate availability is not what's important here. You're going to still need defensive linemen in 2019 as well, and I think that South Carolina's gotten themselves a pretty good one here when it comes to Josh Belk. And then one of the other stories we're going to get into more on SEC Country Live later on this afternoon, pretty interesting comments from Nick Saban. He was doing his Nick's Kids charity golf tournament over the weekend and was pretty candid about his quarterback situation and the need for one of these two quarterbacks. We assume it's going to be Tua Tagovailoa. Vegas assumes that as well. But the winning quarterback in this debate, whether it's Tua, whether it's Jalen Hurts, they're going to have to win over the team. And that's one of the ways that the quarterback competition is going to be decided. I think that's also interesting for, what's going to keep Jake Fromm the Georgia starter, or if and when Justin Fields does emerge, the relationship he has with his teammates is going to go a long way in determining that. I think it's going to be really interesting to see from the perspective of Georgia. I thought that Nick Saban's words in this were pretty candid, kind of interesting, and we'll talk more about them, including playing the audio for you later on this afternoon on SEC Country Live. For now, though, that is your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, for the first time in a while, our first time being back after a week of vacation, let's dive back into our Dog Day Q&A. A lot of times we kind of call this the Dog Days of Summer, and around here we sort of spell that a different way instead of, something negative, the Dog Days, D-O-G. We think of it as the D-A-W-G, kind of a nice, enjoyable summer as they lead into what should be a great fall for the Georgia Bulldogs. We've been kind of previewing that with our Dog Day Q&A question. Today, it's the same question I asked off the top of the show and the same question we sort of communicated about on Twitter yesterday. What is Georgia's biggest strength here for 2018? As I said, I believe it's the offensive line. Many of the people who weighed in on Twitter seem to think that too. I'm curious what our video commenters want to say about this. And by the way, if you're hearing all this for the first time, either on the radio or on the podcast, and you want to weigh in, You, of course, can reach out to me on Twitter at DawgNation Daily here as well. And before I read some comments, I will say one quick thing. That if you can be a team that's led by an offensive line, then your chances of success, I think, have gone up dramatically. And, the naysayers out there, that friend of yours who either cheers for Florida or Auburn or one of Georgia's rivals who says, Dogs aren't going to be any good without Nick Chubb and Sony Michel anymore, I think we would all agree that the task of replacing them is made easier by an even better offensive line. For people who wonder about Jake Fromm's ability to take the next step with his development, the task is made easier by an even better offensive line. Everything about the Georgia offense just hums a little more consistently when the offensive line, if it does indeed turn out to be as good as many of us think it will be. So you can weigh in on that or any subject you want to here on the comment section here today. Mickey Fuquay, by the way, says he loves Jake Fromm, but he's really excited to see Justin Fields. And I think a lot of Georgia fans feel that way, Mickey. I think there is a real excitement to see what he does on the field here this season. I mentioned a moment ago the notion of your friends who cheer for other teams, like an Auburn or someone like that. David Homansky on Facebook says, I don't have any friends that cheer for Auburn, LOL. That's a good point, David. I certainly understand where you're coming from on that. Here on Facebook, Chris Branham also says, the offensive line has improved significantly since 2016. Will not only continue to get better with all the freshman talent coming in, the wide receiver corps should be experienced and impressive as well. And, there were a few votes that I got on Twitter when I asked this question yesterday about the wide receiver corps. I think there's a high expectation for this group, too, because of, the final year of Terry Godwin, a guy who's really grown, not just in stature, he's become a bigger physical player, but also in terms of his understanding of the position. High expectations for him. Obviously, McCole Hardman's a fan favorite, and then there's that thought of, who sort of joins them in that mix. Riley Ridley sort of teased a big breakout year in terms of what he showed you last year in the national championship game, and expectations are also high for him, too. So it's kind of interesting to see the Georgia fans sort of weighing in on the side of the wide receiver corps when it comes to this kind of stuff. Really funny. Mike Mazzell also says that dogs, I mentioned how we spell our Dog Day Q&A. He says dogs only spelled one way, D-A-W-G-S. Listen, you better believe that on this show, that's the way we spell it all the time, and so we appreciate you spelling it that way, too. We got plenty more comments coming up on video in a moment. For now, though, let's get ready to wrap up the show. And as we do so, for the first time in a while, we get ready to do our Gatorade Countdown here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. I missed Eddie, my buddy here, got him out of the kennel this morning to come in here and do the show, and he wants me to tell you that 138 days from right now, Georgia goes back to Jacksonville, beats Florida again in football. It's our Gatorade Countdown. We do it every day here on DawgNation Daily. I'll also say this, while I was on vacation, I sort of got wind of what Steve Spurrier told the State, that's the newspaper there in Columbia, about talking trash or something, and something to the effect of, if trash talking before the game helped, then Georgia would have beaten us a lot more than they did. And I know for a lot of Georgia haters, that's another zinger, Spurrier doing what Spurrier does, but could Steve Spurrier seem any less relevant right now? What he thinks about anything, given the way that he quit on South Carolina, given the way that, Georgia has humbled recently both of his former SEC employers. The ship has sailed by now. We'll see you tomorrow. And for those of you on video, we are running a little late here because we got a late start. Let me see if I can get some permission to take a couple comments here and go a little late and take a few. I certainly have missed getting a chance to do the comments. We had a fire drill in here today. Like, we were literally sitting down, 10 a.m., everybody's getting in position. We're getting our game faces on, lights, camera, action, and then the buzzer starts sounding. And, we work DawgNation World Headquarters, pretty big building here, so we had to, how about that? Maybe the fire drill is back. It's a pretty big building, so when the alarm goes off, you really have no idea of knowing what it is. So we go streaming out of the building. Just as soon as we got down there, we came right back up and came back in. But frustrating stuff there. Let me get a few comments before you get out of here. I did Facebook comments a moment ago. Let me do YouTube comments here for a bit. I want to make sure I say hello to the YouTube folks here. Over on YouTube, Blind Squirrel Sports says, good to see my cousin Eddie again. Absolutely, Blind. It is good to have Eddie back. Enrique Morello, emphatic that he thinks the strength of next year's team is going to be this upcoming year's team is going to be the wide receivers. That's pretty. Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe he says next year, meaning 2019, the strength is going to be the receivers. When you talk about older guys currently on the roster and bring in the freshmen like Blaylock and Hazelwood, that's an interesting thought for sure, Enrique. Brian Kephart says it's offensive line for sure is the strength, but he says second, I'd say it's the football IQ and the leadership in the quarterback position. That's a pretty good thought too. Diedrich Frazier kind of weighing in with similar thoughts. Thanks, Diedrich, for weighing in. Willie McGuire says our biggest strength is coaching. And I understand where people come from on that. My thought on coaching, though, is, if you go back to 2016, let's take Jim Chaney in particular, because a lot of times it's sort of easier to see the impact an offensive coordinator has on the game. Sometimes, you have to look a little deeper to see the defensive-minded head coach's impact or the defensive coordinator's impact. And, when we were doing the show in 2016, it was every Monday there was legitimate animosity that fans felt towards Jim Chaney. It was with good reason. Some of the play calls were just baffling. I was talking to some people the other day, I forget where, and, the subject of that Vanderbilt game in 2016 comes up again, where it's like Isaiah McKenzie getting the handoff, Nick Chubb being used as a decoy. For most Georgia fans, that's the single worst play they'd ever seen in any Georgia game. And, it is to a degree inexcusable, but there is also, I think, a little bit of subtext and backstory to it that Georgia did not trust its offensive line in that inaugural season for Kirby Smart. The play calling in 2017 made a lot more sense because the offensive line was just better. And so in terms of coaching being a strength, I think it probably will be too. But one of the things that makes the Georgia coaches look smart are the players they employ. That when you've got, the kind of players, Kirby Smart uses the phrase, and I like this phrase. A lot of his stuff, I think, to some people feels like cliches. I like the notion of winning your box. Put 11 guys out there, give them a responsibility, and if each of those 11 guys takes care of just that responsibility, then obviously both units are going to go, sailing. Special teams would be the same way. That makes the coaching look really, really smart. And so while I have great respect for Mel Tucker and Jim Chaney and Kirby Smart and all the position coaches, it's the talent advantage on the field that I believe makes those coaches look so smart. Does that make sense? That's kind of my thought on that. Brian Bailey, thank you for the nice words on YouTube. I really appreciate that. You guys were all really nice while I was gone. I'll be completely honest with you. The thing that you're always the most afraid of when you do what I do, show up at the same time every day and do the same thing, you're always afraid that you go away for a week, people are just going to forget about you. People get busy. They got things going on. The fact that so many of you have chosen to, be back with us again today and, let me know that you were, appreciating me and being on vacation, last week. That's really nice. I really appreciate that. Really appreciate that. Ro Hawkins says, BA, I noticed that some recruits are shying away from UGA because they don't want to compete. So, look, I mentioned the Tresman Marshall thing earlier. You can also say the same thing about Jalen Humphreys, maybe. That was earlier last week. I think I'm going to be slow to give any kind of opinions on any of this kind of stuff because of what happened last year. We would have made definitive statements about certain guys a year ago. If I'd asked you in June what you thought of Quay Walker, let's be honest here. A lot of you in the comment section would have said some not so kind things about Quay Walker because at the time you thought that Walker was totally spurning Georgia, had no interest, was playing games with Georgia. A part of that, this is all the stuff that was said. That Crisp County, stuff, there's all that kind of conjecture last year when it came to Quay Walker. Well, on National Signing Day, Walker became, a Georgia legend for tossing that Tennessee hat. So I'm going to be very slow to make definitive opinions about anything in June, given what we saw a year ago. Guys that, if you'd asked me in June if I thought Tyson Campbell was coming to Georgia, maybe there were people somewhere that knew that. For me, I didn't know that in June. So, is Tresman Marshall going to flip to Florida State? There's certainly some, online chatter that says he's going to. I'm going to hold judgment. I'm going to ask Jeff about tomorrow, but I'm going to hold judgment. Jalen Humphreys going to Florida instead of UGA. Is this a situation of he sees a clear path to playing time there? Was Georgia slow playing him? Was this just a straight up head-to-head win for the Gators? We'll ask Jeff about that too. I understand that it definitely gets harder to recruit when you don't have playing time to sell. When you're saying, hey, come here and earn your way on the field by sort of iron sharpening iron, contribute to our depth, that's a tough sell. And Georgia got to make that sell here in 2019. But, given what I've seen from Kirby Smart in 3 recruiting cycles, I think it's going to work out okay. So I understand where some of you are coming from. I am going to withhold judgment on that. Miriam Martin Corbin says, "I'm not worried about recruiting. Kirby gets it done." Yeah, I think that Miriam's opinion is very similar to mine. And I even told Jeff this the other day. I wouldn't even be that worried if I was a Georgia fan if someone even committed to a different school right now. If it's a player that Georgia really wanted, there's one linebacker that comes to mind here who's currently committed somewhere else. Toting around a commitment to some other school, that's not a deal breaker. I mean, if it were, a lot of these guys end up at Georgia wouldn't have been there either. So I think that Georgia's going to be just fine. And I'll go back to that audio we played from Jeff before, where around this time a season ago, when things did not look good for Georgia, and I'll be honest with you, I wasn't, just playing dramatic for the podcast or the video show. I was legitimately worried that Kirby Smart just didn't have early playing time to sell as much anymore, and therefore wasn't having as much success with the recruits. They didn't trust what he was building at UGA. But Jeff came on here and said, and I've got the audio clip, we've played it a million times, that recruits had told him that the Georgia coaches were laughing about the people who thought that Georgia was not going to build a good class for 2018. And when the Georgia coaches were telling that to recruits, this was way before Georgia went out and had an SEC championship college football playoff season. Now, obviously, coaches are going to tell recruits what they think they need to hear, what they want them to hear. But that's a lot of confidence for a program that had been, 8-5 the year before, and no one was picking to do as well as Georgia did in 2017. So the coaches knew a year ago what many of us found out in December and February, and no amount of buzz for Tresman Marshall or Jalen Humphreys or anything like that. Nothing's going to change my confidence in this staff's ability to out-recruit anybody, but Alabama included. Thomas Gwynn, I hope I pronounced that right. I always forget if it's Ginn or Gwynn, and I've got to get ready to get off the air here in a moment. Says once we get back, South Carolina and Missouri, 5-0, 6-0, recruits are going to start flowing in. You're right. And even before that, I mean, look, the visitor list for these Georgia home games is going to be through the roof, and that's going to be all the proof that you need. You're going to start seeing those big names start to show up. Willie McGuire on YouTube says Kirby's going to deliver, no doubt about it. Brian Kephart says, why can't Kirby seem to recruit at the elite level on the defensive line? So, Brian, my answer to that is, and I certainly would agree with you that that's the one position that Georgia has sort of not really brought in a lot of elite names here over the last couple of cycles. My assumption is, and I could be wrong, but my assumption is that part of that's just the small number of elite defensive tackles who've been available. There have just not been a large number of elite defensive tackles available. That can't be an excuse for 2019, though, because there are some good ones. Trayvon Walker is an example of that. The kid up in North Carolina who Georgia seems to be really high on because he's, a giant. That's an example of that. You got to win with these guys in 2019. You can be tolerated for missing on the last couple of cycles, but this year Georgia's got to really show up and pay big dividends there with the defensive lineman. There's no sugarcoating that. All right, we are really late. We had a weird schedule today. Let me get off the air so I can help out our friends who've got to get some other stuff going here. Appreciate you being back on the program today. It's been a lot of fun to be with you. I'm looking forward to a really fun week here in the program. Jeff tomorrow, I'm really excited about that. A couple things to remind you of. We are back on SEC Country Live at 3 p.m. this afternoon. All the SEC Country video channels will have that for you. Podcast going to be up and running here very, very soon on the world-famous DawgNation.com and all the podcast outlets that you've come to expect the show from. And then back again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live presented by Marco's Pizza. Thanks for them to bringing us the show. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.